Hal Stern is a Chancellor's Professor in the Department of Statistics at the University of California, Irvine. His research focuses on Bayesian methods and statistical applications in forensic science, the life sciences, and social science. He's a co-director of the NIST-funded Center for Statistics and Applications in Forensic Evidence, CSAFE, and a member of the OSAC's Physics Pattern Interpretation Scientific Area Committee. So please welcome Hal, and I would invite Hal to then introduce his panel members.
Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a session that the folks at CSAFE, Alicia and I, tried to pull together. This morning's presentation on the handwriting report touched on the likelihood ratio as kind of a direction that's being endorsed. And so we wanted to have some discussion about that. It is not a trivial concept. Statisticians do understand that, actually. And we're happy to be here to try and kind of advance that. The way statistics works in general in all of its areas of application is through lots and lots of back and forth. When we work on a problem in forensics or in medicine, we engage with the people who are practitioners, and we have to learn their language. They have to learn ours to some extent. And so happy to be here to do this. There are three speakers in this panel, myself to start, to try and describe the likelihood ratio in some terms, when it works, when it doesn't work, those kinds of things. We have Steve Lund, statistician, research statistician from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to talk about some of his work related to the likelihood ratio. I guess I characterize it as caveats. We'll see exactly what Steve has to say. And then the third speaker, Alicia, Carriquiry, the director of CSAFE, the NIST-funded Center of Excellence, and a President's Professor of Statistics at Iowa State, who'll talk about score-based likelihood ratios, which is an area in which she and several other people throughout a variety of disciplines are seeing some success. With that having been said, I'm going to allow Alicia and Steve to sit facing the screen so they can enjoy the talk as well. And I'll get us started with an overview of the likelihood ratio. The title I sent forward was Likelihood Ratio and Other Paradigms in Forensic Evidence, but I used to take my kids to Disneyland, and they had a Muppet show, and the Muppet show was this thing where this guy says, "It's a tribute to all countries, but mostly America," which is just a great line. So this is a talk about the likelihood ratio and other paradigms, but mostly the likelihood ratio. So as you all know, and one of the reasons we're here, there's a drive to improve forensic science. That drive is motivated by lots and lots of different things. The success of likelihood ratio and science-based methods to quantify the strength of DNA evidence, I think of as one driver. And then there's been this series of activities over the last 20 years, in a sense. The work of the Innocence Project, finding that about half or more of exonerations involve cases where flawed forensic science was a contributing factor. The NRC report and the PCAST report each raise questions about the underlying science behind some of the forensic disciplines, especially the pattern comparison disciplines. There are a number of things going on now. As I say, there's steps taken to try and improve it. We heard about the NIST NIJ working groups. I was on the latent print group. I heard about the handwriting group today. The National Commission, during its 4-year existence, made some important statements. The OSAC, which I'm participating in, I think Steve is also participating in, trying to standardize procedures. So lots of things happening. When we talk about forensic evidence, it's a pretty broad set of questions that are addressed. So I'm going to narrow us down here today to talk about the place where likelihood ratio is coming up most often, which is in this source attribution setting. We have a crime scene sample and a sample from a suspect, handwriting, glass, fingerprints. And the question is, did the two samples come from the same source? I would say the likelihood ratio is actually a very broad concept. So it applies quite broadly to other places where you might might be doing forensic analyses and trying to figure out the timing of events. Any setting in which you can lay out specific hypotheses that you want to evaluate, the likelihood ratio can be an informative way to think about it. So I just have a few pictures here to ground us, this notion that we want to compare a questioned and a known. So we have fingerprints, shoe prints, and a bullet cartridges here. And then here, some data from glass, a picture of two fibers, DNA. So what I'm going to say should apply to all of these. Some material here that I don't need to describe here, but to, again, set the framework for talking about the likelihood ratio, we're living in this world, the Daubert standard, in which the judge is the gatekeeper, and we're asked to think about topics like error rate, validation, peer review. These are important things to think about in applying methods to assess forensic evidence, expert testimony. And of course, that gets documented in the Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 702. And here, the only thing I would really draw your attention to, especially, is, the word reliability appears here a lot. So reliable principles and methods, and reliably applied. These are important concepts, and again, they speak to the need for there being underlying facts and data and some sense of consistency that people would agree in some sense. So, as I said, I want to talk a little bit about the different approaches that are taken to forensic evidence before trying to focus in on the likelihood ratio. And so I tend to think these days in terms of three broad categories for approaching this source comparison task. One is, in many ways, the status quo in many disciplines, which is an expert assessment based on experience, training, and the use of accepted methods. And as we just heard in the handwriting, this is typically summarized by some kind of categorical conclusion, starting what was on the far left, the 3-point scale of identification, exclusion, and inconclusive. And depending on the discipline, maybe more than 3 points on that scale. Under that approach, what data would look like is the kind of black box study that PCAST has been calling for, that was done by Ullery et al. In the fingerprint case. So that's a way to kind of provide the background in that setting. A second approach is known as the two-stage procedure. In concept, a lot of people are doing this, although I would argue they don't usually do stage 2. So stage 1 in a two-stage analysis is to determine if a crime scene sample and a test fire or whatever from a suspect match. Not in any formal sense, but just stage 1 almost always involves a binary decision. Do these two objects match up to the degree that I can tell? And then the second stage is the stage at which one tries to say, given that they match, how likely is it that there might be a match by coincidence? So in that setting, you actually have two kinds of data that you need. Stage 1 requires its own kind of data, right? That is, if I'm going to declare things matched, I open up the door for what statisticians call type 1 and type 2 errors, or false inclusions, false exclusions, right? And so we want to choose thresholds for making that match decision that optimize with respect to those error rates, and we need to learn about those error rates. And then the second stage requires some kind of database and calibration to say, figure out what basis do I have for understanding how likely a coincidental match is in a particular setting. And then the third approach that I'm going to emphasize talking about is known as the likelihood ratio, and sometimes known as the Bayes factor. So as I say, as I ran through the three of those, all of them require some kind of empirical evidence, or ought to require some kind of empirical evidence about performance. And so this can be studies of reproducibility, reliability, and validity. Just to define those terms, when we think about reproducibility, we think about would the same person get the same answer if they did the task again a day later, a week later. We think about repeatability as whether a different person asked to do the same task, a comparison or measurement would give the same answer. Neither of those have anything yet to do with accuracy. It's just about consistency. And they're important, extremely important, but then the third item on these lists is validity, which is, are we getting the right answer? So if we agree all the time and we're getting the wrong answer, that's not so good. And so studies of reproducibility, reliability, and validity, and they can enter at several stages. They can enter at the measurement process. Is my technique for measuring the chemical concentration of glass fragments repeatable, reliable, and valid? And it can also be applied, as was done in as would be done in the black box study, to examiner conclusions. Are they being done in a reproducible, reliable, and valid manner? So all of those are approaches that, in PCAST terms, talk about the foundation of the field, if you will. But then it's also important that the methods be applied appropriately to the case. Okay. So let me jump in and talk about the likelihood ratio. There are basic two questions that come up no matter any of those three approaches that I ran through quickly. Whoever is doing this analysis comparison must determine the likelihood of seeing, my quotes, evidence like this. We'll talk more about what evidence like this looks like in different settings, if the two samples have a common source, and we also have to judge how likely it is to get evidence like this if they have a different source. Okay. So the likelihood ratio is getting a lot of attention, as Dana mentioned and the previous panel mentioned. It's a statistical concept that provides a unifying logic for comparisons of this sort. As I say, one should understand it goes much beyond forensics. That is, it plays a critical role in the basics of statistics. All statistics students learn about the likelihood ratio because anytime you want to test some hypotheses, the likelihood ratio can play a role. It can be used in medical diagnoses when you have a diagnostic test and want to understand its implications for the disease status of a person. Okay. And as was mentioned in the previous task force, Europe has moved decisively in this direction and has these NC guidelines that Brad and Dana referred to with a pretty elaborate verbal scale for likelihood ratios. So a lot of motivation. This is the only formula, I promise, the only formula in the whole darn talk. Bear with me. In shorthand, there's going to be evidence E, and I'll talk about what that means in different settings, and two propositions or hypotheses, here labeled capital H with a small s, the same source proposition. I believe the two samples came from the same source, and HD, the different source proposition. I believe the two samples came from different sources. So Bayes' theorem is a mathematical theorem. That's all it is. It's just a fact. You can like it, dislike it, doesn't really matter. It's just a fact. And one of the ways that Bayes' theorem gets expressed is as a way of relating two hypotheses. And so this formula that you see before you has three terms, three pieces. The piece on the far right, in some sense, comes first logically, which is it's the odds relating these two hypotheses. Right? So is one more likely than the other? This is a priori. Before I've looked at this piece of evidence, what do I think the relative probability of the two propositions is? So we're talking about two propositions. So if one has 60% chance of happening, the other's got 40 and vice versa. Right? So pretty straightforward, that last piece. Where it comes from, not so straightforward, but what it is, pretty straightforward. Okay? The middle is the piece that we're going to end up talking about, which is the relationship of the hypotheses to the evidence. So they ask, how likely would it be to get evidence like this in the two scenarios? I argued just a couple of slides ago that any analysis of the forensic evidence is implicitly asking these questions, and now I'm asking that we make it explicit, that we try to quantify to the extent we can the likelihood, the probability, the chances of getting evidence like this if they came from the same source. How much variability is there within a source? When someone signs their name, how much does it change from time to time? Okay. The denominator asks the same question, the second question I raised: how likely is the evidence if they were created by different sources? How big a difference would we expect to see between a forger and a genuine? How big a difference would we see from two different panes of glass, right? So that middle piece is trying to characterize how likely you are to get the evidence. And the mathematics of it says, if I had those two pieces, the mathematics tells you what to do next, which is you actually multiply them together, and they tell you how to update. So the Bayes theorem part of this is there's a prescription about how one should update their thinking about probability. But the key to all this is the middle term, because the term on the right that starts the process is an opinion. It starts off with, what do I think the likelihood is of these two hypotheses? And most people get a little uncomfortable saying, I want to talk about the likelihood without looking at the evidence. And so I want to focus on the middle piece, the likely ratio, and that's where a lot of the conversation has gone. We can imagine or envision the role of the forensic examiner as being to talk to the triers of fact and the attorneys about the likelihood of seeing the evidence in these two scenarios. There's fine print. I know lawyers like fine print and footnotes, so I put one up here. That is, I'm hiding a lot of stuff in this very quick overview of the likelihood ratio. In particular, the role we talked about, context-relevant information, that somehow has a role to play here. Also, when I teach about this to examiners or to students, there's always a question, why do some people say Bayes factor and some people say likelihood ratio? I would say for almost everyone in this room, the distinction is irrelevant. That is, statisticians, when faced with each other, could go on about it for days, years, have gone on about it for years. But for purposes of us in this room, we're talking about the same thing. So we're talking about the likely ratio. And I've kind of said all of this. Statisticians are well aware of how complicated this is. It is hard to understand for lawyers. And if we get lawyers and judges to understand, it's going to be even harder to get triers of fact and juries to understand. So that's recognized and not minimized, certainly not by me. So that's kind of an important part of how this gets rolled out. And what I want to do in the time that I have left is go through 3 cases that you can kind of think about as the good, the bad, and the ugly, or something like that. A couple of slides on how the likelihood ratio works, where it works. And so DNA is kind of an example of that. And then a place where you can see how it might work. It's not used often, but there have been publications, it might work. And then places where it's going to be really hard to use. So DNA works in part for, we had a question earlier this morning about kind of discrete characteristics versus continuous characteristics. One of the reasons the likelihood ratio works well in DNA is you have discrete characteristics. The table on the left there is a DNA profile. So for, I think there are 16 markers listed here, you know what alleles are in the sample found at the crime scene. And then if you identify a suspect whose blood we think might be the source, we can get their DNA profile and compare them. And so the evidence in this case is very clear. It's 2 matching profiles with a specified set of alleles. And to do the likelihood ratio, we need the numerator, the probability of observing matching profiles if there's the same source. And in many respects, because it's a discrete characteristic, the answer is 1. That is, if this person was the source, their DNA has to match up to some level of measurement error. In the DNA case, the more complicated part is the denominator, and in every case, the more complicated part is the denominator. How likely is it to find matching profiles if the suspect was not the source? Or in other words, how many other people are marching around out there that would match this profile? How likely is it to find one? Right? That's the second probability. And that, in the DNA, ends up with very large or small probabilities, very large numbers of such people, very large number of likelihood ratio. So you might end up with a likelihood ratio of 2 million, which says the chances of finding a random person walking around on the streets of Manhattan or in the world at large that matches this specific profile we found at the crime scene is very low. It's 1 in 2 million. The chance of finding it, if this is a suspect, is 1. So those two probabilities get compared, and we say, whoa, this evidence, these matching profiles give me great confidence that they support the hypothesis that they're the same source. Important to understand why it works here when we move on to places where it doesn't work so well. It works well here because there's an underlying biology that we understand. That theory tells us how to do the probability calculation that we want. And there are databases available that fill in the numbers that that probability model requires. So to do a likelihood ratio, ideally, we have some probability model that tells us how the evidence comes to be, and we know the underlying data that we need to fill in that probability model. And of course, there's a long history of peer review. Not to say that DNA is perfect, right? There are still issues, but to understand how the likelihood ratio can work, what I would say single source DNA can serve as a very helpful example. Mixtures, not so much. So case two, how could the likelihood ratio work in other settings? And so we segue to a place where we have continuous measurements, okay? Trace evidence. So here there are glass fragments, maybe broken glass at the crime scene, suspect apprehended a few blocks from the crime scene, glass fragments on the jacket or the sweater. So we have two sets of glass fragments, and we'd like to know if they came from the same source. Here it's possible to take a variety of measurements. Refractive index is one, more complex chemical analyses is another. Can we do a likelihood ratio? Well, the answer I put here is perhaps. The argument relies on these two pictures. The one on the right, and these are hard to read, and I recognize that, are measurements from fragments, refractive index measurements from fragments from a single source of glass. And the only thing you have to notice here is the horizontal axis. The refractive indexes here are varying in the 4th decimal place. That is, they're almost exactly the same every time I measure that piece of glass. The picture on the left is from a sample of different pieces of glass, or from many different pieces of glass, and their refractive index. And you can see for this particular type of glass, it varies in about the 2nd decimal place. And so the argument would go to create a likelihood ratio, I need to be able to think about two things. One, how would the two sets of fragments I see, the variation they exhibit, how likely would it be to see that much variation if they came from the same source? Well, the picture at the right before said not very much. And if they came from different sources, we'd expect to see more. So the problem, there are some challenges in doing likelihood ratios in this case. People have done it. There are articles published on glass. Alicia and I, 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, tried to do this for bullet lead. And so you can make attempts at this, but it's very challenging, okay? Why? Because the pieces that you need, that is a probability model that tells you how variable measurements are going to be from within the same piece of glass, are not as well known as they are in the biological case. So you can make a stab at it. Statisticians love bell curves, so we throw bell curves everywhere, but you can do fancier things too. So you could try to fit that, and then you could also try to describe the variation among sources in the entire population, and they would allow you to compute a likelihood ratio. But there's a lot more to it than that. You have to understand how glass is manufactured and distributed. Does everybody in my Irvine's a planned community? Virtually everyone who lives in the neighborhood has glass that was put in at the same time, at least originally, right? How does that impact my likelihood ratio and the like? So it can be hard, and the answer can be sensitive, which a very influential paper that Steve Lund, our next speaker, and Harry Iyer published. So he'll say more about that. But I can see how it might work in a place like trace evidence. Even though it's continuous, we might be able to learn about the measurement variability both within a same source and across different sources. We advertise talking about pattern evidence. Pattern evidence, it turns out, is among the hardest, right? So there are lots of examples. The picture you see is a shoe print. On the right, a crime scene print. On the left, an image of a suspect shoe. But lots of other types of evidence. Really challenging for likelihood ratio. Why? Starts at the very first step, defining what is the evidence E in this case, right? Remember I said evidence like this. DNA profile, easy, matching alleles. Glass, not quite as easy, measurements. Now you're talking about a 2D or 3D image, or two 2D or 3D images, right? To try and compare. What features are you looking at? How are they being defined? I saw an article recently that looked at a handwriting sample and said, you know, the probability that I would expect to see this much variation between the questioned and the known if the same source wrote it is 0.7. I'm like, whoa, where did that come from? How do you get a probability like that? What are you looking at? You can't tell just by looking at the signatures. What characteristics are you looking at? And once we figure out the evidence, we still have this challenging task of trying to talk about the probability or the variation within same source, distortion of fingerprints, right? We were just talking at the break, variation in the marks made by a tool, right? The same tool, different times. How much variation is there? How do we characterize that? And then you need to have some knowledge about variation across a broad population of tools or fingerprints or the like. So there are two things that are happening. One, which Dana talked a little bit about, is these kind of subjective likelihood ratios. And that's the direction the Europeans have gone. They've kind of accepted that in the absence of models like the ones we need here, examiners should be encouraged to think subjectively, to try to put their knowledge into this framework. Very challenging. Another idea in which things are going, and I'm going to say very little because Alicia is going to say more, is the idea of trying to replace the evidence by some kind of score. That is, the evidence is hard because it's two images. A score says how similar or different are those two images, replaces that by a one-number summary that says the difference between these two is S, the score. And then you get, as in this picture here, the red's a little hard to see, a distribution of scores from samples that you know match and from samples that you know do not match, where you know ground truth. And that allows you to judge the score and essentially form a likelihood ratio on the score. So I hope that helped. My summary is as follows. The likelihood ratios are a logical way to evaluate and summarize forensic evidence. Many people are saying the logical way to summarize evidence. The advantages, there are advantages that I think are important, and they're listed here, explicitly requiring that we think about the two hypotheses, providing a quantitative summary or a graded scale rather than just binary outcomes, accommodates both continuous and discrete data. An important point is the last one that's listed, which is the likelihood ratio is a way of mapping a specific set of assumptions to a quantitative summary of the evidence. And that helps with something that Dana said that I think is paramount, which is transparency. The analysis should be transparent. The likelihood ratio has some questions. We're going to hear about them in what follows. But if you put your assumptions out, all's fair. We can question them. We can ask how the answer changes if you change those. The challenges I have talked about, we require some assumptions about the distribution of evidence. Where does that come from? We need to find a reference distribution. We need to know about the population of possible sources. The likelihood ratio will change as I change some of these distributions. And of course, we should not forget the challenge in conveying likelihood ratios to the trier of fact. So that is all that I wanted to say. So thank you for your attention. I guess I went longer than I wanted to, a couple of minutes if there are questions now. One question.
What are your thoughts on that last point you said, the challenges about conveying the LRs and trier of fact and using scales or verbalization as, I mean, in the last talk we saw moderately strong versus very extremely strong, things like that.
Great question. I think the verbal scales are going to be important first step and maybe last step. That is, I think that's going to be the way the information gets conveyed. Ultimately, there's some interesting research going on by one of my colleagues at UC Irvine named Bill Thompson. He's been doing some studies using the Amazon Turk, using this distributed workflow on the internet, but he is representative of jurors, we believe, and he's asked them to compare two statements such as the likelihood ratio is 10,000, and there's moderate support for the same source hypothesis. And he's asked people to make a series of pairwise comparisons like that. And what comes out of that is a unified list where you can see what numerical value people are assigning to an expert saying there's strong support, which it turns out to be like 100,000 to 1 or something. We don't know yet how much this depends on the type of evidence and other information that's provided. But that's the kind of research, I think, that in the first session it was brought up, we need more research. That's the kind of research that I think may help answer your question as to both how we do it and how we calibrate it. That is, how people are currently hearing, like the verbal statements, how strong they think the verbal statements are. And that's a clue for us how to link it up to the likelihood ratios.
I think the Europeans have come up with, a scale that equates verbal scales with numerical scales. Do you find anything, let's say, challenging about that, or any flaws in terms of how those numerical equivalents were achieved or stated?
So you're talking to a statistician, so I love numbers. Numbers are my life. But I think it's very helpful. Brett put up, and David too, the scale. The European scale is on the far right, and it's like 13 levels. So it's pretty rich, maybe richer than I would go in going that deep. I think it's making gradations that are not so easy to do. But I do think it's going to help a lot with people understanding.
Just one quick follow-up. Do you think that that should apply to all types of pattern evidence?
I would like to see us move in that direction, yes. I have some concerns about the subjective likelihood ratios. So there's two questions here, right? One of which is, where's the likelihood ratio coming from? And then there's, how do we express the likelihood ratio? And so I've said in response to both questions, expressing the likelihood ratio, I kind of understand that that's going to be really challenging, especially the quantitative side. So verbal scales can be really helpful there. How it should be formed, I would like to see continued research in our center and others to try and build up the technology to actually calculate likelihood ratios. For pattern evidence, they're pretty far away still. Maybe one more question.
I had a question, and maybe you've answered this implicitly with respect to Dana's comment about the likelihood ratio in handwriting in our report there is really as subjective as what they're doing now. They're just putting their own subjective opinion as to weight on one side of the scale as opposed to the other. And wherever it comes out, that's their decision.
Yes,
The likelihood ratio really doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Well, it puts in place a requirement for that more explicitly being done, right? And in particular, that there are two propositions that ought to be considered, that we ought to be thinking about what features we're looking at and how likely they are under those scenarios. So it makes it a little bit more explicit than I think it is at present.
All right, so it guides the thought process.
Yeah. Last one.
But I have a different view. I mean, the likelihood ratio that leads to a score may make evidence incontrovertible because there's a higher likelihood than not that it comes from the same source or whatever. So unless the defense attorney is well versed in terms of those relevant factors that may have a bearing on the result, then it almost becomes incontrovertible evidence, and that would be, I think, a concern.
A concern?
A concern in terms of defense attorneys' capability to defend their clients.
Well, the question is twofold, right? One of which is accurate likelihood ratios are ideally incontroversial in the sense that you say, but for example, when we tried to do it in bullet lead, what we came up with was likelihood ratios of like 2. That is, finding these matching chemical profiles was twice as likely if they were manufactured at the same time than if they weren't, because of the way bullets are manufactured and distributed. So when the quote-unquote incontrovertible number was provided, it was so weak that the evidence, people testifying that these were manufactured at the same time and therefore sounded stronger than the incontrovertible. It is true that in the pattern discipline there's a fear, and we don't know the answer yet, that the numbers that will come out will look DNA-like. That is, that your fingerprint was found at the crime scene, and the chance that someone else's fingerprint would match to the same degree that yours does, is 10 million to 1 against. I understand the concern, but my hope is if we can get the numbers right, that advances both science for both sides.
Thank you, Hal. I very much enjoyed your presentation, and thanks to everyone here for the opportunity to speak today. This talk that I'm presenting is a result of work done together with my colleague Hari Iyer, who also works at NIST. Before jumping in, I'd just like to express that the viewpoints discussed here are our own and are not intended to reflect the viewpoints of anyone else at NIST. And also a disclaimer that we're only trying to discuss what makes sense to us and are not trying to claim that these are new perspectives. So I'd like to begin with an illustration to give us some context around which to discuss. And so for this illustrative example, suppose we're interested in comparing the patterns left from tool marks. And so there's two patterns shown here. The one on the top the one on the bottom is a pattern that was recovered, say, from a crime scene, so the source of which is unknown. And the one on the top is a test impression gathered from a tool that may have left the mark on the bottom. So in order to try to assess this evidence, we begin with a process for comparison. In this illustration, I wanted to pick something that would be very tangible. So what's going on here is for each of the profiles, a tool called a profilometer goes and just measures the height or depth of the grooves left in the marks, and that's what this red wiggly line is. And then the vertical bars are just identifying where there was a hilltop along that profile. And similarly, the black line is using a profilometer applied to the crime scene impression, and the black vertical lines are just representing hilltops along that profile. And so if you had characterized those patterns in this way, you could ask a computer to do registration, scanning across the different potential alignments and looking for what orientation produces the greatest correspondence. And here, by greatest correspondence, the metric used is just the maximum number of consecutively matching stria. In these two profiles, after scanning the top against the bottom, it was found at this particular orientation that you got a region with where 6 consecutive hilltops aligned. So that is, there was no hilltop in one profile that was not present in the other within that region. So the output of this comparison approach would be 6. So if we were going to try to understand the implication of seeing a particular result, we'd want to go and try to understand the behavior of this method of comparison or evaluation. And the approach to doing that would be, as Hal had referenced, taking some comparisons where both impressions were known to have originated from the same tool and applying this evaluation strategy. And we might just keep tally of what the results of this comparison process were in each instance. And that's what's represented by this top histogram. So the height of those bars is just saying, out of 100 attempts comparing marks from the same tool, how often did we see the various number of consecutively matching stria? Does the mouse show up? Okay, so this peak here is at 8. So out of the 100, a little more than 30 or 30 or so comparisons produced 8 consecutively matching stria. But as Hal mentioned, we can't just look at the behavior of the process when we're comparing two patterns known to have originated from the same source, we also have to look at the performance or behavior of this method when comparing things that are different. And so that's what's represented here in the bottom. So this is when comparing tool marks left by different tools. In general, or the most common out of these 100 comparisons was 1. So there's never a point where there's exactly even spacing, but it sometimes occurs. And the maximum observed here, there's a little blip right there of 5. Okay, so say that's the empirical basis that you have, the study that's been done. And now in a situation where you don't know whether the two impressions were left by the same tool, but when you produced, or when you examined it, it produced a maximum number of consecutively matching stria of 4. And now it's, what does this data that you have tell you about whether it seems to have come from a comparison with a mated pair or a non-mated pair? But in order to try to get an interpretation for the value of 4, we can't simply read the data. So, for instance, among our evaluations of tools not originating from the same, or of marks not originating from the same tool, we never saw a 4 before. But I think very few people would agree to a statement that because we haven't seen it in our 100, you're never going to see it. Right? And in fact, we've seen a 5, and for many people they say, well, if you've seen a 5, just because you haven't seen a 4 yet, there's still some chance you would see a 4, but what is that chance? And so instead of reading directly from the data, if we're going to try to characterize something like the probability of seeing a 4, we have to do something more with this data. We have to look beyond what we actually have as tangible results and start trying to apply what would be called like distribution fits or model fitting. There are many different ways that you could take a fixed body of data and represent it as a distribution. Here, for each case, I've plotted 3. So each of the different color curves are representative of probability assessments that one might apply to this collected body of data. I'll say that each of them is a fit to this data. So we can't say that one is data motivated and that the other is not. And in fact, they're even the same methodology for fitting. It's just one parameter that goes over the degree of smoothness. How smooth do you want your distribution to be as a result for this data? So the black curves have the lowest smoothness setting, so they are following most closely what the observed heights were. But then you can see as a result of that low smoothness setting, there are some times where we see little blips and valleys out here. And some person might say, I don't really think there's any reason for why a 13 should be more probable than a 12 or a 14. That seems kind of weird. So I don't think that's a very great characterization of the distribution. So they might invoke something smoother. So they might pick something like the red or the green. And now the green has reached a smoothness setting where kind of there's an ascension to a single peak around 7 or 8, which is the most commonly observed values in our data set, and then a steady decline as we get out to higher and higher number of consecutively matching stria. And the same type of thing can be applied to the other data set. But now if we go back and ask the question about, well, what's the probability of getting a 4 when comparing marks from the different tools? Not to anybody's surprise, the different models give different answers. So the probability associated with a 4 for each of the curves is indicated by the number of the same color. So under the black curve, the probability of seeing a 4 from this distribution is represented as 0.016. Under the green, it was 0.047. So they're differing by about a factor of 3 just over these 3 models. And this is not an exhaustive list of the models that one might apply to this data. But on the denominator, or on the non-mated, it matters a little bit more what your modeling choice is. And that's generally a truth, as Hal mentioned. The difficult part is trying to characterize just how rare are the rare things. And that has a very strong influence over the ultimate characterization of the weight of evidence in the form of a number. So here, we're differing by 4 orders of magnitudes across 3 models, again, each of which are fit to this data. So just to complete to the LR characterization, just among these 3, if you were only to consider these 3 different models for the mated and these 3 different models for the non-mated scores, the minimum likelihood ratio that you would get for this score of 4 is if we take the smallest value from the top divided by the biggest value in the bottom, and that was about 2.5. Now in the other range, we take the biggest from the top and the smallest from the bottom, and that gives us 187,000. So there's a difficulty here in identifying what model one might use, and it can matter. So that was the illustration. That's the type of thing I'm going to be referring to in the subsequent slides. So some comments on probability. Hopefully one thing that's been conveyed is that probability is not a description of what's been observed. You're reaching beyond what has been observed. Some might say that a probability is representative of a personal belief based on the information available to them, so their personal best guess. Others might view it as a characterization for where we would arrive at if we could collect unlimited data. So if we got to keep collecting all the comparisons to our heart's desire, we had infinite funding, then where would that distribution converge to, and what proportions would we see under each of those scores? But under either of these perspectives, there is no single right answer. There is not one universally appropriate interpretation or representation of that data in the form of a probability distribution. The likelihood ratio, as has been introduced, if you're actually going to provide a number, it is a ratio of 2 probabilities. So to the extent that there isn't a uniquely appropriate probability, they may talk about a likelihood ratio in the context of it's my personal assessment or my expert assessment. Well, under the viewpoint of personal probabilities, the receiver of information should be concerned with what is their likelihood ratio, what is their interpretation of this information, not what is the likelihood ratio of any one particular expert. The likelihood ratio of any one particular expert can be information to a decision maker or a member of a non-expert, so say a judge or a jury, or even the attorneys who are trying to make decisions about plea bargains or whether to proceed to trial. But there is no justification that this is the answer for a likelihood ratio, or that it is your answer. And in fact, no one can expect an expert to characterize the exact perception for somebody else. They can't tell you what your likelihood ratio is. And perhaps the best that they could do is to try to articulate what a range of likelihood ratios occurs under different sets of assumptions. They can't tell you what assumptions you should make, what assumptions you should not make, but they may be able to illustrate the sensitivity or range resulting from a particular collection of data. And certainly a practical strategy, like with any opinion, is to try to ask multiple experts to try to start to illustrate the spread for the results. That was under the kind of subjective probability. Under a long-term relative frequency, so this idea of trying to predict what the distribution would look like if we could get as much data as anybody would ever want, statistical inference tools are very helpful in trying to label any considered model as reasonable or unreasonable, or consistent or inconsistent with the currently available data. And under this view, you might say that a likelihood ratio value is plausible if there exists at least one model that is consistent with the data that you have that produces that likelihood ratio, which is nice because then you can start to say, oh, this likelihood ratio value is plausible because here's a model that we can't eliminate from consideration, and it produces this result. However, the flip side to that is very difficult, that a likelihood ratio value is only implausible if there's no corresponding plausible model that can produce this. And this is really hard, right? So maybe a cartoon example for this concept is, we could prove the existence of unicorns if we brought one here, but it's very hard to disprove the existence of unicorns. As soon as somebody, that one came to me in the moment, sorry. Okay, so under either of these perspectives of probability, a best guess to either where we would ultimately arrive if we got all the data we could possibly want, or whether I'm trying to characterize what your perception or somebody else's perception of this evidence might be, the best guess is expected to be wrong. We're never going to get exactly the right answer. And that's the purpose of an uncertainty, is to try to characterize, give some indication as to how far off your answer might be. And I think that this is a very important consideration, and it affects the type of questions that we might ask from an expert. So I think a question we should not be asking is, what's the best value? I think that does not exist, and I think it's dangerous to try to be focusing on a single value. Similarly, I think it's not yet the right question to be asking us, is this LR value that's been offered reasonable? But rather, I think what we should be doing is, for whatever body of information, whatever set of validation data has been collected, the question remains, what is the range of reasonable interpretations? So I think this speaks to the reliability of the use of likelihood ratios. I think, at least from my perspective, reliability is sometimes a difficult word to nail down. So Hari and I have been just trying to develop at least a working notion for how does uncertainty and reliability relate to one another. And what we found helpful is to consider the notion that to be reliable, a report or testimony must have a low risk of being wrong in a way that affects the ultimate decision. And the reason we're interested in the word reliable is that this shows up in rules of evidence. So as Hal mentioned before with Rule 702, reliable or reliably shows up in two of the terms here. And also there's this notion of sufficient facts or data, that the testimony is based on sufficient facts or data. And I think, I feel like this rule speaks to what the expert's intended meaning is, but that's not the only place where uncertainty or reliability shows up. I feel like Rule 403 that talks about we may exclude evidence if there is a substantial danger of confusing the issues or misleading the jury. And I feel like this language connects to the reliability or the use of likelihood ratios because the concern is this. We don't want experts or the recipients to falsely believe that any reasonable assessment of the available information would differ only negligibly from the offered value. And if an expert appears in court and says, I've done this analysis by this process, I've gathered this data, I've made these assumptions, and I've arrived at this particular value, I do think there's a risk of an audience, and maybe even the expert themselves, feeling like that value is well established. And it's not to say that we know that that value is wrong, it's just we don't know how wrong it might be until we can do something to try to rigorously study what the range of values might be. And we're not the first to try to, certainly not the first to try to provide any insights or start a conversation in this. In fact, there's been pre-existing work on trying to guard against extreme values resulting in model choices specific to modeling tails of distributions. There's a paper by Peter Vergeer and others, and I'd like to just read quickly from the abstract that they know that LR systems are sensitive to extrapolation errors, and that's this idea of your data resides in some range, but you may have an instance where you have a value that was not seen under one of your studied populations, and now you're trying to use the curve that you fit to that data to tell you what the behavior is out in the range where you've never seen anything. And that's what's meant by the extrapolating. And they say, given the unknown behavior in the tail region, one may define the problem as when to stop extrapolating. And they offer a suggestion that you should just limit the range of likelihood ratios. So specify a minimum or maximum value that the likelihood ratio could produce based on the number of observations available in the validation data set. So regardless of what model you choose, if it's off in the tails and it says something that's 1 billion, but you only have 1,000 observations, you pull that back down towards 1,000. And I very much agree with that as with a strategy. In our efforts, we've tried to speak in maybe more encompassing generality that if you're going to provide an LR, you should try to rigorously investigate and express the range of reasonable values that one might identify. And you may have to communicate the limitations for that you have not checked all models. Nobody expects you to check all models, so you can't eliminate the possibility of there being a different value outside of the range that you're articulating. Wrapping up, I wanted to say that this is not, so in previous talks or from our paper that we had written, some people walk away with the interpretation that you're saying, oh, so experts should provide categorical conclusions, or they should speak directly to posterior probabilities of source. And that is not our intended message. And we agree with the community that there are advantages offered from using the likelihood ratio framework. And in fact, I would say it is certainly indisputable that the thing to do is consider all the possible explanations for whatever scenario you're asked to evaluate, and then each time some evidence comes in, ask, how does that relate to each of these scenarios? Does it make my perception of those to be more or less plausible among the collection? But I don't feel like there is a sufficient basis to say uniformly we should be trying to provide specific LR values, or to provide even whether that's on a verbal scale, which is just a translation of a specific value. I think that's premature to say that that's universally the solution we should move towards. And from my understanding, looking at the comments written in beneath the expression of Federal Rule of Evidence 702, the Federal Rules of Evidence permit but do not advocate for the experts to communicate in the form of an opinion at all, but that always seems to be the presumption of the community, is how do we give the best language to present their opinion? And it seems like it should, at least in some cases, be on the table for consideration or further discussion, that the expert is not expected to say what the information available to them means, but what the information available to them is. So they could focus on presenting an overview of what the information available that would serve as the basis of an interpretation. So the cards have been put on the table, and that can be the focus of their contribution. So just final bit, back to this tool mark example. If an expert describes, here are the profiles that I examined, applying this method produced in 11, I then went out and tried to find a substrate that's, if this was a windowsill, wood with roughly the same hardness and the same thickness of paint of the same type on it, and attempted to make marks in prying open a window, as was at the scene of the crime. And here's the results that I got from applying this same methodology in instances where ground truth were known. I think that is expertise. I think that is extremely valuable information. I think that should be presented to the court. It is not clear to me that anybody has a special ability to go beyond that and say, what is the probability of an 11 under this set of results? And I don't know that that should be the default expectation in all cases. So I feel like in some instances, there should be at least an opportunity for the expert to have fulfilled their duty by providing what is the information available to them, rather than being expected in all cases to say what that information means, even in the form of a likelihood ratio. Some of these viewpoints, or most of these viewpoints, were expressed in this paper published in the Journal of Research for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Despite our best efforts, the broader community has largely been met that with some confusion. The community of for forensic statisticians, well, does not necessarily agree. And there have been some publications with alternative viewpoints expressed here. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attention. I don't know if there's any time for questions.
There's time for some questions.
I'd like to go back to the example that you used in illustrating the problems of extrapolation with various assumptions to fit models to a data set in order to lay the foundation for a likelihood ratio. A few observations. First, what you're dealing with to begin with was a set of data which was actually properly expressible in cardinal numbers. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're just talking about the collection of scores obtained during past
Yes,
instances.
and you're dealing with a set of data where it is actually expressible in cardinal numbers, and there's no controversy about that.
That's right. Each of the comparisons could be illustrated to an audience and the result demonstrated.
And then the second thing is you're dealing, one of the reasons you're having, just on the models that occurred to you, and then we get into a deep philosophical question about whether or not all available models are even possible to exhaust because maybe they haven't occurred to you in terms of models of distributions, right? But getting past that, in the ones that occurred to you as being plausible, you ended up with this huge possible range of likelihood ratios from 1 in
From 2.5 to 187,000.
187,000. Well, in a situation like that, wouldn't you say, well, first, one of the problems is because you have such a small sample size, because these extrapolation problems are related to sampling theory, right?
Certainly, as you have more data, the range of distributions that fit to that data narrows.
Well, that's right. And then when you get a range that wide, looking at the implications for the law, wouldn't it be proper, there's where your 403 comes in. Whether you're going to allow the expert to interpret this for the jury, because how the hell is the jury going to know what these things mean? Really? Okay, I can accurately tell the jury what they mean, but how many jurors are going to have any understanding of what we just talked about? So unless you let the expert explain that, I don't see how you can ever have a model where you just tell the facts and you don't have the expert doing some explaining. Secondly, in the example you gave, this would be a perfect situation where I wouldn't want to put in front of the jury because the information is not, you can call it 403 or you can simply call it not specific enough to have meaning to the jury bearing on what it's not usable information to an ordinary juror. But do you disagree with that?
So I would say in instances where the understanding is the range of LR characterizations is overly broad, that may be the exact time where you want to put something like this. I think there is value in these observations. I think trying to narrow down that what that value is in the form of a explicitly provided likelihood ratio has concerns.
But do you think there's value to an ordinary jury attempting to perform a common sense ordinary jury's function to hearing that from an expert?
To hearing this information?
Yeah.
To say, all right, so I think in this question, I cheated in producing an example where it's pretty easy to understand what the comparison process is. It's just counting of strata, and that was done intentionally. But I think to an audience, they can understand, here's the process I'm following, here are the results that I obtained. And I think they can weigh from this. Out of the 100 times that I checked, I haven't seen anything beyond a 5. This is an exact, characterization of the data that I've collected. And to them, I think most people would translate that to there's a small chance, there's some type of small chance of seeing something beyond a 5 And so I just put some small number on an 11. And I don't think somebody who processes this information would go so far as to try to put an exact number on what that is. But in producing a likelihood ratio, you're forced to do that.
Well, I understand that, but the point is, isn't it a rather dangerous piece of information to put in front of an ordinary jury because you don't know what their interpretation is going to be, at least without some further explanation rather than just presenting the data.
So do you have a proposed something else that the expert would advise to here that stands in the midpoint between producing a likelihood ratio value or a characterization of what the information available to the expert is?
No, what I would think under these circumstances is that it's so unpredictable what use the jury would make of this information that it probably does not it is not helpful in the sense that's usually used in the law. I'd like to make one other point. When you deal with subjective probabilities in the European sense, they attempt to, at least you started out with a data set that had proper cardinality. They start out with an impression and they get cardinality by making numbers up.
Yeah.
And I believe that is a bridge too far in generating any cardinally expressed likelihood ratios, and I would like just to be on record saying that here, as I have said in many other places. Thank you.
We can take a couple of quick comments, but we're going to have to move on. Go, Mark.
I appreciate the remarks that Michael has made, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, so I'm going to simply embellish what he said. I think the expectation that when an expert gets on the witness stand, that he's the only person in the room, or that he and the judge and the jury are free of litigants having questions either on direct or cross-examination is an unexpected outcome. So if you're in testifying and you presented it just the way you presented it now, saying, putting the cards on the table, but I don't have an opinion, this is just the data, these are just the facts. There are people in both chairs at the two lawyer tables who are going to jump to their feet to put words in your mouth. And they're going to ask you direct questions. And if one litigant or the other doesn't do his job, then whoever it is that speaks the loudest and the most often is going to make the impression, even with your equivocation, he will have already planted the seeds through the question. And no matter how much you try to say, no, I can't answer it that way, he's testified for you through the questions that have come up. So there has to be preparation on the part of the expert to be able to deal with those questions, even if you're not comfortable providing them initially on your own. That's just the reality of giving testimony.
I just want to follow up what Professor Reisinger said, because I have a question both for you and for Professor Reisinger. Professor Reisinger was talking about the 403 standard, Federal Standard 403. And I'm wondering, if the range of LR values is so wide, wouldn't it render an LR expression so unpredictable as to be unreliable under 702? And would you be prepared, you, Mr. Lund, Professor Lund, would you be prepared to testify in that fashion, given those parameters?
So I have a complicated answer to that. Yes, I would be prepared. That is not the role of NIST, though. So if you're asking for me as an individual to appear in court, there are concerns. So to me, it only makes sense that if a value is going to be provided for somebody to make a decision, it is very essential to understand how well that value is known. And if that information is not made available, I am concerned with the reliability or the appropriateness of the presentation of that information in court. That's my personal perspective.
Okay. I'm just saying, in response to Michael's question about jury understanding, in the last Journal of Forensic Science publication, and one before that, there's an article by, I believe it's Garrett, that talks about how jurors perceive the likelihood ratios as the numbers go up. So you might want to look at that, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Steve, that was great. And if that wasn't caution enough, I bring Alicia to talk. Provide us some more caution.
Yes, more caution. Thank you again for having us. I know that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I am going to try and be brief. So I'll follow with what Hal and Steve have talked about. Here's a little outline. I'll go very quickly over the problem and the likelihood ratio in theory, and go to the challenges in real life because Hal and Steve have already covered those. And then talk a little bit about this score-based inference, the pros and the cons of score-based inference, and some concluding remarks for now until we learn more about what's going on. So the problem we've talked about many times, typically or in many cases, forensic scientists are faced with questions of source, specific source, the same but unknown source, pretty much the same for this particular purpose. Do two pieces of evidence have a common source? So that's the question. Hal mentioned the prosecutor's proposition and the defense's proposition, and the likelihood ratio is just a one-number summary. And from a statistical point of view, it's a very reasonable, logical way to proceed. You just look at the chance of observing the evidence that you have observed. If the prosecutor is right, over the chance of observing the evidence you observed, if the defense is right. So the bottom there, the denominator, is what we call sometimes the probability of a coincidental match. And like both Hal and Steve said, this is great, but we need a ton of information in order to implement this approach. And in particular, we need a lot of data and we need some statistical models. And this is where the challenges arise. So even though I think that nobody can deny the fact that this is a logical approach to evaluating evidence, it turns out that in practice there's a lot of difficulties. Evidence is not nice most of the time. Most of the time, the measurements tend to be very highly dimensional. For example, Karen Kafadar talked about glass yesterday. There we're measuring anywhere from 12 to 18 elemental concentrations. They're highly correlated. If you're looking at fingerprints, examiners identify many minutiae. Again, those minutiae tend to have specific geometric arrangements, so they cannot be assumed to be independent. If you're looking at images, 2D images, 3D images, you're looking at thousands of pixels. This is your data. And so computing likelihood ratios from these highly multivariate, typically highly correlated vectors of measurements is really very difficult. You cannot turn around and pretend they're all independent and come up with a series of univariate tests. That just doesn't work. So even if we could formulate these highly multivariate models for this type of evidence, there will, like Steve said, inevitably there's going to be more than one reasonable model that we could pick. And even if we all agreed on the one reasonable model, we still have to estimate the parameters of those models. So there's different values that these parameters could take on. And so talking about the likelihood ratio is kind of absurd. There is no single likelihood ratio that we can talk about in any specific case. There is a range of plausible likelihood ratio values in any situation. So let me make a little bit of a change here and talk a little bit about score-based inference, and then I'll get back to the issue of likelihood ratios when we use scores rather than the actual measurements that we take on our evidence. So yesterday, I don't know if those of you that were here for the technical presentations yesterday, we had examples of, we talked about fingerprints, bullets, breech face, handwriting, what else? Oh, glass. And in all of those 5 different areas, we discussed the possibility of using a score. A score is simply, a similarity score is simply a one-number summary that you obtain by combining the measurements of the different features in an intelligent way. And there's many different ways of computing scores. I'm not going to get into that. And there's some advantages, right? So if I can take 18 elemental concentrations in glass and combine them into a single score, suddenly the dimensionality of my problem goes down from 18 dimensions to 1 dimension. It's much easier to find a model in 1 dimension than in 18 dimensions. And so that's one big advantage of working in this score domain. We can be very smart about the way we pick these scores, and so we can find, if we want to make sure that we can discriminate same source from different source, then we can optimize the way we pick the scores so that we find scores that are highly discriminatory, for example. So it may be the case that a single feature or 2 features, and by features I mean measurements of whatever it is, like for example 2 elemental concentrations are not sufficient to allow me to tell apart fragments from different panes or from the same pane, but perhaps if I combine those 2 measurements in a smart way, I may be able to extract more information. And finally, it's relatively simple, and I say relatively here with a smirk, to construct reference distributions of the values of the scores. So if you can imagine collecting some large databases of pieces of evidence that are known to have the same source and pieces of evidence that are known to have a different source, and computing the similarity score for all these very many pairs of evidence, of pieces of evidence, then we would have sort of reference distributions of the possible values that these scores can take on when they have a common origin and when the evidence have a different origin. So this is all fine and dandy, and so let me give you a few examples of when this actually works kind of nicely. So Karen talked about glass. We have done some work at Iowa State with glass recently. So the data that glass examiners work with are laser ablation ICP-MS measurements of the concentration of many elements, typically 18 elements in glass fragments. These measurements are fabulous in the sense that they are extraordinarily precise. There is nothing wrong with these measurements as long as you have a competent operator of the instruments. There's very little publicly available data, unfortunately. The German Bundeskriminalamt, Peter Weiss and his colleagues, they have a rather small data set that includes 62 different panes of glass from, I'm talking about architectural float glass. This is from many different manufacturers, but unfortunately only 1 fragment from each of these 62 panes. And then there was 1 pane that was collected by the FBI, was purchased somewhere here somewhere in Virginia. This is a pane from which 34 fragments were measured, and in fact, one of those fragments was measured on 11 consecutive days. So those measurements are not independent, but let's suppose that you have, depending on how you look at it, either 34 or 44 fragments measured from this pane. At ISU, we've been spending quite a bit of money, not CSAFE money, because this is out of scope for us, but this is my own personal money from my own personal endowed chair, collecting additional LAICP-MS glass concentration data. So far, we have analyzed 48 panes of glass from 2 different manufacturers in the United States. The difference between our data and all other existing data is that we have taken 24 randomly selected fragments from each pane of glass so that we can get a very good estimate of the within pane variance. And each fragment has been measured 5 times, with the exception of 3 fragments per glass that were measured 20 times. So this is a very good research data set, and as soon as we get this paper published, I'm going to release it to the general public, and we're going to be collecting more data that will also be released to the general public. So the score, we built a score using a random forest just some way to build a score. And using these 18 concentration elements as the features, the measurements. We had about 15,000 pairs of fragments that were known to come from the same pane, and about 400,000 pairs of fragments that were known to come from different panes. And by different here, Karen made a comment yesterday where that different has many different connotations, right? So in this case, different was not so different. When we talk about different, we talk about only architectural float glass samples with the same color and the same thickness. So these are relatively similar panes of glass. This is what you get. So just look at the top, not the bottom. So this is so the gray distribution is the distribution of scores, values of the scores among pairs of fragments that are known to come from different sources. And the black distribution, this one over here, is the distribution of scores, similarity scores among pairs of fragments that are known to come from the same piece of broken glass. You can see quite a bit of separation here. So in principle, you could say, if I observe a score below 0.5, chances are these two fragments came from different pieces of glass. If I observe a score above 0.5, chances are these two pieces of glass, these two fragments came from the same piece of glass. So that's kind of nice. We'll get back to this example in a bit. Shoe prints. This is where it gets a little interesting. 10 minutes? Okay, I'll be done actually. This is where it gets a little interesting. How in the world do you extract features from shoe prints? So the work that we have been doing, this is the question shoe, this is a reference shoe, and we have been, the black, this is the pixels, what's called the edge pixels of this image. The computer finds those. And we've been looking at local areas, this one area here, another area here, another area here, and using tools from graph theory and other things. This work, by the way, is joined with Harry Ayer at NIST. We find corresponding areas in the question shoe, and then we can put those two corresponding areas one on top of the other, so the blue with the blue, the red with the red, the pink with the pink, and extract information from those. And we extract like 7 or 8 quantitative pieces of information from those, and those are our features. Well, again, we can combine those features, perhaps using a random forest. Again, we love random forest at Iowa State. And again, you get a similar thing, right? So the blue distribution here corresponds to the scores that you get for the known non-mated pairs of shoes. And the red distribution here corresponds to the values of the scores that you get for the known mated pairs of shoes. That's kind of good. Bullets. I talked about this yesterday. These are the scores that we got for same story. Extract features from the 3D images, compute a score using a random forest. You see the theme. The gray distribution here is a distribution of scores of bullets that are known to have been fired from different guns. The orange distribution is a distribution of scores of bullets known to have been fired from the same gun. So, looks absolutely fabulous, and it's kind of promising, but there's issues. So here are the issues. So the scores of, as I said earlier, effectively do reduce the dimensionality of the problem, but there's a price to pay, right? Because you're losing information. You're combining 18 features into a single value. There's no question you're going to be losing information. I've talked about random forests. Random forests are great, but in a sense, they're a little bit of a black box in that we don't know exactly how these features are combined to obtain the score. We get information. We know which features have the most weight in the final score, but there's a lot that we don't know, and so it's kind of hard to tie together features to scores. We don't really know. It's kind of hard to do. And finally, these likelihood ratios computed using these complex scores are very different often from likelihood ratios we might obtain if we computed those likelihood ratios using simpler scores. Like imagine I take the sum of, I normalize to the same units, and then I take the average concentration of the 18 elements in glass, just compute an average, and that's my score. The likelihood ratio that I would obtain if I use that as a score versus the likelihood ratio that I obtain using the random forest scores are going to be quite different, may not even be proportional to each other. So that's a bit of a complaint. So in the glass example, for example, I show you two different scores here. This is the random score that we propose. This is the standard 4 sigma approach expressed in the form of a score. It's essentially an average. This is the ASTM standard. And here we have 5 situations. The first 2 are fragments from the same pane. The last 3 are fragments from different panes. And the values of the scores that we obtain using our method are these ones, and the corresponding likelihood ratios are these. Our random forest score reaches the right conclusion in all cases, and the likelihood ratios are pretty convincing. But when you use, for example, a different score, the average score in ASTM, it's not quite clear, right? So for example, the very last 2, if you were to use this ASTM score, you would reach the wrong conclusion. It's not a very strong wrong conclusion, but it is the wrong conclusion because the likelihood ratio is about 1. And so the only thing I wanted to illustrate here is how using the exact same data, 2 different scores, same likelihood ratio approach, you get very different answers, or you can get very different answers. The story is that we still, even if we have this course and even if we have this wonderful situation, we still need to pick, if we want to construct a likelihood ratio, we need to fit a distribution like Steve talked about to those frequencies of scores that I showed before. So we did this sort of funny exercise. We took the scores, we took the scores, these ones, for the shoes, and we said, let's fit a beta model. It doesn't matter. Beta is reasonable for this. So we fitted a beta distribution to both the known matches and the known non-matches. We estimated the parameters of that beta distribution using a standard approach called maximum likelihood estimation. And we tested to make sure that that estimated model, the postulated model, fitted the observed data. So we used a test, a statistical test. And then we went ahead and said how many other values, combinations of values of the parameters for the same beta model would also fit the observed data, and so in a sense would also be plausible models, right? And it turns out that we found, and so we varied the values of the parameters over a grid. So this was totally arbitrary, but it turns out that we found about 4,000 different sets of parameters for the beta model. So same model, different parameters, that were plausible in the sense that they passed this Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. In other words, the postulated model was not different from the observed distributions. So here we have on the x-axis is the log 10 value of the likelihood ratio, and this is for when the score was equal to 0.01. This is from when the score was equal to 0.4. This is for when the score was equal to 0.8. And for example, if you look at the range of values of the likelihood ratio when the score is equal to 0.8, in the log 10 scale goes from 4.5 to about 6, which in the original scale would be something like 30,000 to about 1 million. So there's quite a difference here. And so for any value of the score, there's a lot of possible values of the likelihood ratio, all of them coming from plausible postulated models. One more thing and then I'm done. There's another issue that one has to be worried about with likelihood ratios based on scores. Sometimes they do funny things. Not often, but this has to do with this extrapolation on the tails that Steve was talking about. Let me go back to the bullets example from the Phoenix PD data. Imagine now I'm going to do what Steve did. So for a range of values of the score, these are the scores on the x-axis, I am going to compute the ratio of the height of the orange distribution over the height of the gray distribution. So that would be an empirical score-based likelihood ratio type of statistic. And what do we expect? We expect to see a monotonic increase of the likelihood ratio, right? As the score increases. So we want to see that the probability of orange gets higher and higher and higher, and the probability of gray gets lower and lower and lower as the score increases, right? And so some sort of monotonic behavior. Here's what we observe. And so this is great. So as the score increases, the likelihood ratio increases. But look what happens in this end here. When you have very, 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 very low scores, because you're extrapolating the tails of those two distributions, and because the orange distribution has a bigger variance, the tail of the orange distribution will dominate, in other words, will be above the tail of the gray distribution no matter what. And so at the very extreme, you observe this weird behavior that says the lower your score, the more likely it is that you have mated pairs, which is of course completely absurd. So this has to do with this, we need to trim, how far do we trim? There's some things that one needs to be aware of. So the parting thoughts is that I am not saying that the likelihood ratio paradigm is fatally flawed, by no means. I am a fan of the likelihood ratio for estimating the weight of evidence, but one has to be very careful. Implementation in real life can be tremendously tricky, in particular for complex types of evidence like pattern evidence. I think that in most cases there's no such thing as a unique likelihood ratio. Unless we have an enormous amount of data. I don't know that we will ever get there. For pattern evidence or highly multivariate measurements, it's very difficult to come up with plausible models in the original scale. So we are often limited to working on this score dimension, and we need to better understand the behavior of the likelihood ratios when we base them on scores. So that would be it. Thank you.
So a few minutes for questions for Alicia or
Matt.
So I guess for all in terms of trying to find some way of expressing the relative probability. Let's back up. Let's not use the relative.
Wait.
The probative value
Yeah.
of a piece of evidence. Do you have a feel for what avenues have been closed off in terms of statistical approaches or types of evidence?
Can I take a step there? Sure. So I'm sort of with the common sense approach, right? So kind of like what Steve says and what Hal says too.
There's pretty good evidence if you look at the distributions of the scores. I mean, who's going to doubt it? Assuming you have enough data and assuming those reference distributions of scores are reliable and so on, who's going to tell you that a 0.75 is even remotely likely if the two pieces of evidence don't have a common source? I think the caution is when you start approaching extremes and when you rely on extrapolations of the observed values. When you have to extrapolate beyond the observed data, I think that gets a little tricky.
Yeah, I'd add a couple of thoughts. I'm not sure this is directly addresses your question, Matt, but there are two things that I think I want to mention that haven't really been said since we've been so tightly focused on the likelihood ratio. One is, we're not kind of starting de novo. So there's a status quo in a lot of these disciplines. And so we need to think about advantages relative to what's happening now, right? Where you have experts testifying, purely subjectively based on their training and what they see in the evidence. And so, the models are attempt, as I say, to sometimes put the cards on the table. Maybe not the way that Steve would, but to put the cards on the table. So that's one comment that I wanted to make. The second thing that I would make, and this is something I tell all of the students in basically all of the statistics classes I teach, there's somehow this perception that, gee, there ought to be a right answer, a number that's the right answer. You know, but we certainly, in this room, we don't hold the English language to that standard, right? That is, the whole basis for our judicial system is that we could take the same set of facts and weave different stories. And so a lot of what I hear when I hear Steve and Alicia do their caveats is, there's a wide range of stories that these data are telling in Steve's pictures that you can tell with these data. But as with the stories we tell in trials, some are more plausible than others. And so the concern I have with what Steve and Alicia have both just done is to say, if I say the rule is any model that can't be rejected from these data is equally plausible, I don't think that's right. And so I think we ought to be thinking about, you know, some are more plausible than others, and we ought to weigh those more heavily, as you would expect a jury to do with your plausible explanations in a trial.
You know, let me say one thing. I agree with you. I don't think that any model that fits the data is plausible. That was just an illustration to show that even if you vary the model a little bit, you get different values. Yeah.
So I would say part of the weighing of the different models is a model in itself. And so then the question is just shifted from, you know, in isolation, does this distribution fit this data, to, you know, what are the reasonable choices of distributions that we will consider to do the weighting in advance? And that, you know, that I think that does produce a different characterization of what the range is. My reason for not trying to talk about that here is I think that's a more complicated illustration of what type of uncertainty is trying to be characterized.
Matt, we're good for lunch? Great. Thank you all very much.